Special Forces soldier Zhang Junhao traveled to the anti-Japanese battlefield, but forgot about the past. Starting from being a cook, special operations were constantly stimulated during the process of escorting American pilots, and the heroic deeds of the Iron Blood anti-Japanese war won everyone's admiration. After completing the escort mission, he became the captain of the Special Operations team and led the team to become the Iron Fist of the anti-Japanese war, causing the Japanese army to be frightened and ghostly. Keywords of the novel: Anti-Japanese War Special Mixed Forces. No pop-ups. Download the complete collection of Anti-Japanese War Special Mixed Forces TXT, and read the latest chapter of Anti-Japanese War Special Mixed Forces. Chapter 1. Brave Cooker. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Brave Cooker. A string of bullets flew past Zhang Junhao's right face, and he felt the scorching heat and ferocity of the bullets. Dan Yu, like a god of death, surrounded Zhang Junhao, who was carrying a large iron pot on his back. He would take away his life at any moment, but Zhang Junhao stood there like a piece of wood. Lie down quickly. The old squad leader shouted at Zhang Junhao a few meters away. Where doesn't Zhang Junhao want to lie down? But the body doesn't obey commands. The brain seems to be filled with chaos, constantly cutting and sorting. Zhang Junhao has had the same experience, which is when ghosts press the bed while sleeping. No matter how anxious you are, it's useless. Only when you wake up can your body move. But now I can't wake up, my body doesn't seem to belong to me, and my thoughts are like floating foam in the water, drifting far away. Die, die. It's better to die happily than to live like a vegetable. A mortar shell flew in and exploded nearby, with multiple shrapnel hitting the large iron pot on his back. Dang 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 dang, seemed like a large hammer continuously hitting the pot, causing Zhang Junhao's head to buzz and his consciousness to instantly lose. A surging wave of air hit, and his body fell forward like a bundle of straw as the scattered soil spread. Junhao, Junhao. The old squad leader's hoarse cries awakened Zhang Junhao. Zhang Junhao quickly looked up, but to his surprise, he lifted his head. A bloody smell of muddy water dripped down from the face, blurring the vision. Ah! I actually lay on the body just now. Zhang Junhao knew all three flesh and blood blurred corpses, and like Zhang Junhao, they were all members of the militia. One of the three corpses, Zhang Junhao, had a particularly deep impression of him. When he was alive, he would smile whenever he spoke. In his early 30s, he has a beautiful wife, 2 lovely sons, and a well-behaved daughter at home. If the Japanese devils don't come, this person will definitely continue to live an ordinary and happy life. Now he has been killed by the Japanese devils and his body is soaking in blood. What about his beautiful wife? What about 2 adorable sons and a well-behaved daughter? Zhang Junhao's heart hurts so much. Junhao, you're not dead. I thought you were dead too. Zhang Junhao looked at the old squad leader, who was lying on the ground with a gun pointing ahead. A lonely yellow tooth showed great care and kindness to Zhang Junhao. The old class monitor is just over 40 years old, but he looks 60 years old. The cheeks and bladder are sunken, the skin is black and yellow, and the arms have bulging veins. The gray-white clothes were soaked in blood and water, and with a shake of the head, a large amount of soil was scattered. Zhang Junhao's brain was violently shaken by the explosion of a mortar shell, and a large number of disorganized neurons connected in his mind. Long-lost memories were instantly restored, and some fragments of past events immediately emerged in his mind like close-up shots from a movie. Zhang Junhao not only knew the names of the 3 corpses he was holding down, but also recalled some things that the old squad leader had quietly told him. The old squad leader, surnamed Huang, said that he was from the new 4th Army, coming from the direction of Shanghai. The purpose of crossing Hangzhou Bay to Zhejiang East was to establish an anti-Japanese base. The commander of the 3rd Theater Command, Gu Zhutong, the executioner, ordered the new 4th Army not to establish an anti-Japanese base in Zhejiang, and the new Fourth Army troops coming from Shanghai could only be concealed in the name of guerrillas. The old squad leader was instructed by the leader to infiltrate the county militia, win over the county militia, and strive to have the county militia collectively join the new Fourth Army guerrilla forces. The old class monitor sympathizes very much with Zhang Junhao, who has amnesia. When Zhang Junhao cooks for the militia, he will take the initiative to come and help. The grass shoes on Zhang Junhao's feet were made by the old class monitor himself. Zhang Junhao lived his life like a sleepwalk. Without the help of the old class monitor, he would have been treated as a fool by the militia and suffered more unbearable bullying. We are surrounded by the Eastern Devils, hurry up and retreat. The old class monitor fired a shot into the distance while talking to Zhang Junhao. The gunfire was loud, and Zhang Junhao's ear hummed again, causing his eyes to involuntarily blink. The old squad leader's gun is too close to Zhang Junhao's ear. Another bullet hit, and the old squad leader quickly pressed down on Zhang Junhao's head. Zhang Junhao's face fell on the body again. Zhang Junhao was not afraid, he just burst into his breath to prevent his nose from sucking in blood. There was another violent explosion not far away, and mud and water fell like a rainstorm. Zhang Junhao smelled the strong smell of smoke and blood in the air. Zhang Junhao pulled out his right hand from under the old squad leader's body and wiped his face, his hand covered in mud and blood. "Give me a gun!" Zhang Junhao suddenly shouted out. "You haven't even touched a gun, how could you shoot? I'll cover you, you run back quickly." The thin face of the old squad leader moved slightly, his eyes fixed on the front. Zhang Junhao turned his body and pulled out a bird gun from under the pressed corpse. Several bullets hit, and Zhang Junhao and the old squad leader both lay down at the same time. Zhang Junhao looked at the bird gun and sighed heavily, saying, "The little devil has mortars and heavy machine guns, but we only have the bird gun." The old class monitor looked at Zhang Junhao in a daze. For the first time in such a long time, he heard Zhang Junhao speak coherently. "The gunpowder is soaked in water and cannot be ignited," the old squad leader sighed heavily as he glanced at the bird gun. "Captain Huang, quickly withdraw. Several devils are charging towards us." This was Li, the leader of the militia, shouting at the top of his lungs. Zhang Junhao looked at Li Lian's strengths and saw more than a dozen Hanyang-made pistols and several shell-mounted pistols shooting continuously at the Japanese devils. The gunshots were very chaotic and muffled. Zhang Junhao, whose brain is half clear, is now able to make judgments about the situation based on the sound of gunfire. The firepower of Captain Li's team is too weak and there is no possibility of confrontation. The old class monitor quickly untied the broken iron pot tied to Zhang Junhao's back. Zhang Junhao heard the shouting of Japanese devils. "How can we still retreat in time? As long as you show your head, it will explode. Withdrawing to Captain Li's place is death, and fighting against the Japanese devils is also death. Both advance and retreat are deaths. It's better to face the Japanese devils and kill them one by one. Long-range shooting is definitely not a match for the Japanese devils. Close to hand combat, the Japanese devils will inevitably lose their weapon advantage. Such a simple truth, Zhang Junhao can figure it out." Zhang Junhao and the old class monitor looked at each other and shook their heads, their eyes wide open, listening attentively. They not only heard the voices of the Japanese devils, but also the sound of footsteps. The old squad leader suddenly jumped up without warning, holding a Hanyang-made rifle in both hands and stabbing a Japanese soldier with the barrel. The Japanese devils stabbed the old squad leader with their sharp bayonets on the 38th big cover. The old squad leader's gun didn't have a bayonet, how could they defeat the Japanese devils? Zhang Junhao is in a hurry. Without hesitation, Zhang Junhao grabbed the edge of the broken iron pot with his right hand and suddenly jumped up, rushing towards the Japanese devils like lightning and fire. The Japanese devils clearly didn't have time to see what secret weapon Zhang Junhao was throwing at him. They were stunned by fear, and with a loud bang, they smashed the iron pot onto the Japanese devils' heads. The broken iron pot instantly shattered, and the Japanese devil's body shook and swayed. Blood flowed from the head along the brim of the hat. The old squad leader's Hanyang-made rifle stabbed the Japanese devil's chest, causing him to fall. Zhang Junhao threw himself forward and rolled on the ground, grabbing the 38th cover as the Japanese devils fell. With his face tilted back and his back lying in bloody water, Zhang Junhao turned his hand and supported the stock of his gun to the ground. He aimed his bayonet at a Japanese soldier who was charging towards him with the 38th cover. The pointed bayonet entered the front chest of the Japanese devils and pierced through the back chest. The bayonet on the 38th cover in the hands of the Japanese devils pierced the ground. Just a few centimeters away, if the bayonet were to go deeper, it would also puncture Zhang Junhao's body. Zhang Junhao could clearly see the facial condition of the Japanese devils at the time of their death. His round face twisted continuously, his eyes bulging, and a faint cry of "yeah" erupted between his teeth. His body twitched a few times, his head drooped, and a stream of black blood flowed down the bayonet like tap water. Zhang Junhao saw 4 or 5 little devils only 3 meters away from him. He quickly rolled on the ground, drew out his bayonet, stood up, and stabbed the nearest little devil with the 3 or 8 big covers. The bayonet collided with the bayonet, and the little devil, who was not much higher than the 3 or 8 large covers of the bayonet, turned out to be a skilled swordsman. The inch of force in his hand was so strong that Zhang Junhao stabbed fiercely. With a forceful flick from the little devil, the tiger's mouth felt a shock, and the gun was almost released. At this moment, Zhang Junhao could no longer care about the old class monitor. He was all focused on quickly killing the few little devils in front of him. In a short battle, the brave win. Any hesitation or timidity will inevitably lead to being stabbed to death by the Japanese devils. A little devil rushed towards him with a 38 big lid on his side, and Zhang Junhao quickly took a step forward diagonally. While passing the bayonet, he smashed the butt of his gun at the little devil's door. The little devil Peng's face was instantly smashed, and his body rolled and fell to one side. The gun in the little devil's hand was released, and the bayonet plunged into the soil, causing the stock of the gun to shake uncontrollably. The little devil in front of him stabbed Zhang Junhao with his bayonet, and Zhang Junhao also used his strength to pull and hit the bayonet. The gun in the little devil's hand was repeatedly pushed by Zhang Junhao with every inch of force, causing his feet to slip and his body to tilt slightly to one side. Speaking quickly, Zhang Junhao took a step and the 38 large cap gun in his hand popped open the little devil's 38 large cap gun body, and the bayonet stabbed into the little devil's chest. Zhang Junhao lifted the bayonet, twisted it, and quickly pulled it out. After the little devil's body shook, he continued to thrust towards Zhang Junhao with the 38 large cover. Zhang Junhao was startled and quickly jumped to the side. The bayonet in the little devil's hand pierced into the body of the little devil in the mud. The little devil fell to the ground along the gun, crouching and convulsing, motionless. Zhang Junhao saw that the gun in the old squad leader's hand had been replaced with a 38 big lid, and the bayonet on the gun was also piercing the little devil's stomach. Behind the old squad leader, a little devil was stabbing at him with a gun. Zhang Junhao raised his gun and fired at the back of the little devil. With a loud gunshot, the little devil was immediately shot by his servant. The old squad leader nodded forcefully at Zhang Junhao while drawing a gun. It can be seen that the old class monitor is extremely grateful to Zhang Junhao. Zhang Junhao lay on the ground, shooting at the constantly rushing little devils. The old class monitor also lay on the ground, shooting at the little devils continuously. Zhang Junhao and the old squad leader shouted and reminded each other while shooting. After multiple little devils fell, the remaining ones retreated one after another. Zhang Junhao crawled back and forth, searching for bullets and grenades on the body of the little devil. The old squad leader roared at Zhang Junhao, "Hurry up. After the little devils retreat, they will definitely fire again." Hurry up. Hurry up. Hurry up. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Resistance against orders. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Resistance against orders. Zhang Junhao did not follow the orders of the old squad leader. Although Zhang Junhao has only partially recovered his memory, he is now able to think simply and intuitively know that there will be a battle ahead. How can we do without a good gun and enough bullets? Every Japanese devil is equipped with a considerable amount of ammunition, 2 grenades, and 120 bullets. The team led by Captain Li is equipped with Hanyang-made bullets, each with only 5 bullets. More people are equipped with bird guns. How can bird guns kill enemies on the battlefield? Don't even think about it. As long as there is an opportunity to pick up Japanese ammunition, you must never give up. After the old squad leader ran back to Li Lian's place, he shouted at Zhang Junhao and ordered him to immediately withdraw. Zhang Junhao ignored and continued to search for ammunition. A little devil has 3 bullet boxes, the front 2, each containing 30 bullets, and the back one containing 60 bullets. After removing the bullet box from the little devil's body, Zhang Junhao stuffed it into the pants that had been removed from the little devil's body, using his pants as a tool for loading ammunition. Each little devil also has 2 grenades. These are treasures. Zhang Junhao only observed for a short while and felt a spark flickering in his brain, so he immediately learned to use it. Zhang Junhao only remembers being a cook in the militia, and he doesn't remember anything before that. Zhang Junhao felt extremely confused. How could the cook be proficient in using firearms? How can one use a bayonet to slaughter Japanese devils? Curious. Is he a born warrior? Not only Zhang Junhao was confused, but everyone in the militia was also confused. The old squad leader couldn't call back Zhang Junhao, so he lay on the ground and punched the ground. I wish I could run to Zhang Junhao's place and forcefully pull him back. The old class monitor genuinely cares about Zhang Junhao, and he doesn't want him to be killed by the Japanese devils. When the old squad leader joined the militia, Zhang Junhao was already a member of the militia. He didn't know anything, didn't speak fluently, and didn't coordinate his hand and foot movements. He felt like he had suffered a serious head injury and was in the early stages of recovery. The people in the militia all regarded Zhang Junhao as a fool, forcing him to do all the heavy and dirty work. The old squad leader is from the new 4th Army and has seen comrades who are in the recovery period due to head injuries. In the eyes of the old class monitor, as long as Zhang Junhao is given time, his body will definitely recover slowly. As a veteran, he has a particularly strong ability to observe. From Zhang Junhao's words and actions, the senior squad leader can infer that Zhang Junhao is highly likely to be a well-trained regular soldier. Standing with a straight waist, even when sitting, the waist has never loosened. The old class monitor watched Zhang Junhao's hand and found that the second section of his middle finger had a very hard calluses, with a particularly thick palm root and calluses on his fingertips. Many characteristics indicate that Zhang Junhao is an old warrior like him, and his training level is extremely high. Just now, Zhang Junhao's statement further strengthened the old squad leader's inference, and he firmly believed that Zhang Junhao's abilities were greater than all members of the militia, and even more powerful than his old new 4th Army. The old class monitor gave Zhang Junhao meticulous care, and in the process of caring for him, he also developed a deep affection for him. He witnessed Zhang Junhao's body gradually recovering with his own eyes. And he taught Zhang Junhao how to cook by hand. The old squad leader watched as Zhang Junhao crawled back and forth beside the corpse of the enemy, his heart gripping his throat, praying that God would allow Zhang Junhao to safely retreat. The members of the militia looked at Zhang Junhao and couldn't understand why a fool suddenly became the bravest warrior. Half of the members of the militia, including the platoon leader, have already died in battle, and fear has enveloped everyone in the militia. Some even have thoughts of running away. But seeing Zhang Junhao still searching for ammunition on the Japanese devils inspired his last courage and continued to lie there. A mortar shell exploded not far from Zhang Junhao, and the old squad leader suddenly stood up and roared, "Hurry back." A string of bullets hit, and the old squad leader quickly got down. Lieutenant General Li ran from afar and shouted to everyone, "Colonel Zhang of the Military Statistics Bureau has contacted the headquarters of the Military Statistics Bureau through radio and reported that the road to Lishui Airport has been blocked by the Japanese Army. The 3rd Theater Command and the headquarters of the Military Statistics Bureau have ordered us to immediately escort American pilots to Jinhua. Shengxian has been captured by the Japanese Army, and the temporary 35th and 9th Divisions have withdrawn from the main battlefield. We have 2 Japanese divisions, the 70th and 22nd Divisions, and are active. The 3rd Theater Command and the headquarters of the Military Statistics Bureau have ordered us to spare no expense in escorting American pilots to a safe area alone. Why do we have to die for Americans? We are just ordinary people, we need to go home. In order to escort 3 American devils, we have already lost many people and we don't want to die. I don't care about the Military Statistics Bureau or the 3rd Theater Command, I just want to go back and accompany my wife as soon as possible. After hearing what Lieutenant Li said, more than 10 members of the militia immediately started shouting together. Lieutenant Li pulled out a shell-breaking pistol and pointed it at the head of a member of the militia, his face twisted, and the scar on his right face trembled like a venomous snake. His eyes protruded and he roared, "Do you dare not execute orders? I'll kill you." Captain Li scanned everyone inside heavily, saying, "We can't go back. The 2 Japanese divisions have set out, and on our way here, Japanese soldiers are everywhere. Colonel Zhang said that only by heading towards Jinhua may we still have a chance to survive." Suddenly, a mortar shell flew over and exploded only 2 meters away from the ambush of the members of the militia. All the personnel quickly lay on the ground, and the soil fell like scattered flowers. A blade of grass fell on Captain Li's head. Captain Li looked up and the blade of grass fell. Captain Li screamed, "Has anyone been injured?" Another mortar shell came flying and exploded, and Lieutenant Li quickly got down again. A member of the militia was scared out of their wits and suddenly shouted wildly, fleeing in one direction. Lieutenant Li fired at the fleeing militia, and with a loud bang, the militia did not die under the enemy's gun, but died under the squad leader's gun. Zhang Junhao lay on the ground, holding his breath. His heart rate reached 180 beats per minute, and the hot blood made his mind swell. At this moment, he felt scared and helpless. If a shell happened to fall by his side and killed him directly, it was okay. If his body was left incomplete, how could he still survive? I dare not think about it anymore. The more I think about it, the more it makes my hair stand on end. Zhang Junhao took advantage of the gap between the explosion of the bomb and quickly tied up the 538 large covers he found with the straps that the Japanese had taken off. He grabbed the belt head and pants with his left hand, and a 38 large cover with his right hand, crawling towards Li Lianchang. The distance is only 30 meters, but it seems like a distant horizon. The muddy ground feels like a dead door. Occasionally, mortar shells exploded not far away, and Zhang Junhao judged that the Japanese only had 2 mortars. Zhang Junhao's brain suddenly flashed with a question. Under normal circumstances, a small group of Japanese soldiers were not equipped with mortars, only with grenade launchers. What was going on? My mind is still not enough, if I think further, my head will swell. If you don't understand, don't think. Hurry up to Li Lian's strengths and let's talk. Zhang Junhao kept crawling towards the location of the militia in occasional explosions. Suddenly, the old squad leader jumped out of the ambush of the militia, shouting at Zhang Junhao while quickly crawling towards him. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Experts. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. Experts. The Japanese artillery stopped, heavy machine guns began to scan, and a group of 20 or so little devils, 3 or 5 of them, marched forward with their backs, kneeling on one leg and shooting. Zhang Junhao and the old squad leader were closely monitoring the movements of the Japanese army. Zhang Junhao was aware that directly climbing back to Captain Li's place was highly likely to cause his body to be riddled with Japanese fire, as the Japanese firepower completely covered Captain Li's place. The Japanese heavy machine guns were set up in the bushes on a small highland, too far away to be destroyed. The little devils who rushed over were all well-trained and had extremely strong individual combat abilities. The formation of the little devils may seem loose, but in fact, they cooperate with each other, forming groups of 3 to 5 people. While some advance, others kneel on one leg and shoot. Although all of the 20 little devils used 38 large-lidded rifles, everyone had room to shoot. On the other hand, my own team was completely suppressed by the Japanese firepower. Not only did the militia not have many opportunities to shoot, but even the barrage gun in the hands of the Military Statistics Bureau could only occasionally sound. If this continues, the entire army will inevitably be destroyed. The old squad leader shouted loudly in Zhang Junhao's ear, "Junhao, Major Zhang and Company Leader Li have received instructions from the 3rd Theater Command and the Military Statistics Headquarters. We have decided to escort American pilots to the direction of Jinhua and not to Lishui Airport. I will cover you, and you should retreat quickly." Zhang Junhao smiled bitterly and shook his head, saying, "Class Monitor, we have been bitten by the Japanese army, where can we still withdraw?" The old squad leader poked his head and observed that a bullet hit, causing his hat to fly. The old class monitor trembled with fear and quickly got down. The old class monitor's hair turned gray unexpectedly. Zhang Junhao took out 4 grenades from his pants and handed them to the old squad leader. He whispered, "Can you use them?" The old squad leader held grenades in both hands, as if holding hot potato, with a curious expression on his face, shaking his head repeatedly. Zhang Junhao quickly explained to the old class monitor the method of using the grenade. After listening to Zhang Junhao's words, the old class monitor looked into his eyes and curiously asked, "Who taught you?" Zhang Junhao's mouth grinned, deliberately half-jokingly saying, "Self-taught." The old class monitor stroked the pull tab and whispered, "Pull off the latch, knock hard, won't it explode in your hand?" Zhang Junhao shook his head and said, "There will be a 4.5-second delay. You can knock it off and count it in your heart before throwing it away. Don't worry. The technology level of the little devil is extremely high, and safety is guaranteed." The old class monitor nodded. Zhang Junhao looked at a bushes on the side and whispered, "When the Japanese army approached, we both threw grenades and ran towards the bushes together." The old class monitor looked at the bushes, then at Li Lian's position and nodded repeatedly. That route has a relatively complex terrain with many obstacles, making it relatively safe to retreat. Zhang Junhao and the old squad leader loaded bullets into the gun together. After the bullets were loaded, the old squad leader said leisurely, "Junhao, I told you that I am from the new 4th Army, and my purpose in joining the militia is to make the entire militia join the new 4th Army guerrilla team." Zhang Junhao frowned and nodded slightly. Zhang Junhao surprisingly has a natural sense of identification with the new 4th Army, as if he is also a member of the same army. How could it be like this? Zhang Junhao couldn't figure it out. The old class monitor grinned, revealing his lonely yellow teeth. "If I die in battle, don't be sad. Death for the country is the most glorious. Now that the country is facing difficulties, as men, we should bravely kill the enemy. We must be Yuwumu and be loyal to the country." Zhang Junhao nodded vigorously. The old squad leader continued, "If I die in battle, you need to continue escorting American pilots to a safe area. The current U.S. military is our ally, and these American pilots flew B.25 bombers from the USS Hornet to bomb Japan. After the bombing was over, they flew over and had to make an emergency landing at our location because they didn't know the way to Tsuzhou Airport and ran out of fuel. They are all heroes, and their feats will greatly inspire the Chinese people's confidence in the war of resistance." Zhang Junhao's brow furrowed as he couldn't understand what the old squad leader was saying, but his intuition told him that it was imperative to protect American pilots. Zhang Junhao looked at Li Lian's strengths, where there were 3 American pilots. Zhang Junhao looked at the gray sky and had vivid thoughts in his mind, paying homage to the American pilots. The sky was so familiar, and Zhang Junhao felt like he had often taken a plane to the sky. The Japanese are only 20 meters away from us, the old class monitor suddenly whispered. Zhang Junhao quickly returned to reality from his sticky thoughts, holding the grenade in his right hand and hooking the pull ring with his middle finger in his left hand. He whispered, "Prepare to throw the grenade, follow my movements." Zhang Junhao suddenly pulled off the latch associated with the pull ring and struck the stock of the gun fiercely, shouting loudly, 1 to 2. Zhang Junhao vigorously threw the grenade towards the direction of the devils. The old class monitor followed Zhang Junhao's movements and also threw the grenade out. After 2 loud explosions, Zhang Junhao heard the Japanese scream in agony. Zhang Junhao once again pulled off a grenade ring, struck it, and threw it away. The old class monitor also pulled off a grenade ring again, knocked it, and threw it away. After 2 more explosions, Zhang Junhao grabbed 5 .38 caliber rifles in his left hand and ran sideways with his pants filled with ammunition in his right hand. After running for more than 10 meters, bullets shot densely, and Zhang Junhao jumped forward, sitting on the ground and sliding into the low-lying area. The old class monitor also jumped in afterwards. Zhang Junhao and the old squad leader shot cold shots at the little devils together. Zhang Junhao's accuracy shocked the old squad leader. He fired more than 10 shots and was actually shot and killed by 3 little devils by Zhang Junhao. The old squad leader knew that it was not easy to shoot the small and medium-sized devils. All the devils relied on heavy machine gun firepower to suppress them, and the cat kept moving, lying in a low-lying area with a very small range of observation. Moreover, as long as the probe was inserted, bullets would inevitably hit. The chance to shoot is only fleeting, it's impossible to aim and can only be shot blindly. If Zhang Junhao had enough time to aim, wouldn't he have killed a Japanese soldier with just 1 shot? A master. Expert. The old class monitor secretly gave Zhang Junhao a thumbs up. After shooting for a while, Zhang Junhao took out 2 grenades from his pants and handed one to the old squad leader. He whispered, "Try to throw them as far away as possible. Let's take advantage of the grenade explosion and run over quickly." The old class monitor reached out to take over the thunder while nodding repeatedly. Zhang Junhao and the old squad leader almost simultaneously threw a grenade into the distance. As soon as the grenade exploded, they immediately climbed out of the low-lying area, ran a few steps with their cat on their waist, then flipped over and rolled together. Zhang Junhao used both hands and feet, dragging 5 rifles and pants loaded with ammunition, quickly climbed 2 meters, and then quickly crawled into the bushes. As soon as Zhang Junhao entered the bushes, he crouched behind a huge rock, pressing bullets into his gun and observing the Japanese devils through weeds and small branches. After the old squad leader arrived at Zhang Junhao's side, he immediately observed the enemy situation. Zhang Junhao took out 2 grenades and 2 bullet boxes from his pants and handed them to the old squad leader with a gun belt and pants filled with ammunition. He looked into his eyes and said seriously, "Let me attract the Japanese army here. Hurry up to Director Li Lian's place and move with them." The old squad leader exclaimed loudly, "Junhao, I have experience in guerrilla warfare and have attracted the Japanese. I command you to quickly run to Li Lian's place and move with them." At this moment, Zhang Junhao had already loaded 5 bullets into the gun. After mounting the gun, he glanced through the cracks in the weeds and branches, turned around to look into the eyes of the old squad leader, shook his head, and whispered, "Can you ever do those devils?" The old class monitor was taken aback and thought to himself that he couldn't do it. Zhang Junhao smiled and said, "You are the new 4th Army, and your more important goal is to have all the civilian groups join the new 4th Army guerrilla forces." The old class monitor closed his eyes and sighed heavily. He raised his hand to stroke Zhang Junhao's back, opened his eyes, and with tears flashing, said, "Jinhua is 200 miles away from us. In the north, if you can survive, follow the foot of the mountain and find us." End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Shooting techniques are goddamn good. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Shooting techniques are goddamn good. The old squad leader, holding 5 rifles in both hands and carrying ammunition pants, quickly crawled into the bushes. Zhang Junhao stood up, raised the 38th Great Wall, and fired at a Japanese soldier. With a bang of gunfire, the Japanese were shot in the chest and fell silent. Zhang Junhao quickly lay down, several bullets hit, and grass and leaves scattered. Zhang Junhao rolled with his gun against the boulder, then arched his body and ran to the back of a big tree. He stood up against the tree, picked up his gun, and fired at a Japanese soldier. The bullet hit the enemy's face. Zhang Junhao stared at another devil, quickly pulled the gun bolt, ejected the shell, loaded the bullet into the chamber, and fired. That devil is raising his gun, trying to shoot at Zhang Junhao. Zhang Junhao fired before the devils, and the bullet hit their stomach, causing them to lie down. 5 devils shot at Zhang Junhao together, and bullets hit the tree trunk, shattering the bark. Zhang Junhao lowered his body and ran to a shrub more than 10 meters away, lying on the ground, shooting at the Japanese. After all the bullets in the gun were fired, Zhang Junhao lay on his back and pressed the bullets into the gun. Ears perked up, listening to the movements of the devils. After the bullet was loaded, he quickly flipped over and lay down, aimed at a Japanese soldier, pulled the trigger, and a Japanese soldier who was moving rapidly towards Zhang Junhao was shot in the leg, screaming and falling down. Zhang Junhao transferred again. Zhang Junhao returned to the boulder he had been lying on for the first time, picked up a grenade, pulled off the bolt, struck the boulder, and threw the grenade at the 3 devils. With a loud explosion, 2 of the 3 devils were killed and 1 was severely injured. Zhang Junhao stuffed another grenade into his pocket, grabbed the bullet box with his left hand, and quickly ran towards the other side. The old squad leader, holding 5 .38 large covered rifles and carrying ammunition pants, evaded the Japanese attack and immediately distributed the guns and bullets to the members of the militia when he arrived at Li Lian's place. Captain Li looked at the old squad leader and loudly said, "Captain Huang, the Japanese offensive is too fierce, we don't have a chance to retreat." The old squad leader poked his head and observed that a bullet had hit. He quickly retracted his head and looked at Captain Li, shouting, "It depends on whether Zhang Junhao can attract the Japanese." Captain Li smiled bitterly and shook his head, saying, "No matter how capable a cook is." Lieutenant Li didn't continue speaking, so he naturally didn't believe that Zhang Junhao had the ability to attract the Japanese army, but although he didn't believe it, he had to pray that Zhang Junhao would attract the Japanese army. Being bitten by the Japanese army, if you don't retreat, you can still survive for a while. Retreating is seeking death. The old squad leader taught the militia to use the 38th large cover, and after teaching for a while, they got down and extended their gun to shoot at the Japanese army. In a wide area of over 200 meters, covered with ghosts, the old squad leader understood that relying solely on the surviving militia and military intelligence agents had no ability to repel the ghosts. Captain Li did not believe that Zhang Junhao had the ability to attract the Japanese. The old squad leader put himself in a different position and thought of himself as Zhang Junhao. He racked his brains but could not come up with a good way to attract all the Japanese troops. On the contrary, the old squad leader believed that if Zhang Junhao fought alone and persisted for not long, he would inevitably be killed by the Japanese army. As the old squad leader was pressing bullets into the gun, he looked in the direction of Zhang Junhao. The gunfire in that area was very dense, with occasional explosions. The position of the old squad leader is relatively low, and the specific situation of Zhang Junhao's direction cannot be seen. Based solely on the sound of gunfire and explosions, it can be inferred that Zhang Junhao is being fiercely attacked by the Japanese army. The old class monitor silently spoke in his heart, Junhao, you have the guts. It is honorable to die for the country. Colonel Zhang from the Military Statistics Bureau gestured with his hand at the U.S. pilot's office, explaining the current situation to the U.S. pilot. When a military intelligence agent who was translating had died in battle, communication between the U.S. pilot and Colonel Zhang could only be done through gestures. The expressions of the American pilots were all very tense, shouting at Major Zhang in English. Major Zhang couldn't understand the content of the American pilot's shouting. The American pilot couldn't understand Colonel Zhang's gestures. Colonel Zhang is so irritable. In order to protect these American pilots, too many people have already died. The Japanese offensive is so fierce, and it's unlikely that the whole army will be destroyed. He really wants to let go of these Americans. The lives of Americans are indeed precious. Is it true that the lives of Chinese people are not worth money? U.S. military pilots need protection, shouldn't Chinese people not protect them? All the militia have died. Major Zhang will not feel sorry because the militia is a mob. He was not willing to let the military intelligence agents die in battle. In his opinion, the military intelligence agents are all elites among the elites, and cultivating them requires a great price. It is a pity to die in battle like this. Colonel Zhang communicated with the American pilot for a while, but found it impossible to communicate at all. He angrily returned to the side of 3 military intelligence agents and, together with them, used a shell gun to shoot at the Japanese army. The civilian groups using Hanyang construction and bird guns are all out of bullets, except for 6 groups holding 38 large lids constantly shooting at the Japanese army. The military intelligence agents have run out of bullets left. Colonel Zhang is in a hurry. Principal Zhang Xiao worked in southern Jiangsu and Shanghai for a period of time, and after coming to Hangzhou, his job was to spy on Japanese intelligence. He had never fought against the Japanese army on the battlefield before. At this moment, Colonel Zhang felt extremely confused, thinking that as long as the Japanese army rushed forward and escorted the American pilot team, they would surely be completely annihilated. What should we do? Colonel Zhang couldn't think of a good way to repel the Japanese army. Major Zhang noticed several Japanese devils slowly touching him, and the little devils walking at the front suddenly fell down. The remaining devils continued to touch in the direction of Major Zhang. Colonel Zhang was about to shoot, but because there were very few bullets left, he would not shoot until he aimed. Just as Colonel Zhang aimed, the ghost also fell down. Colonel Zhang was stunned and quickly moved his body to another place with many weeds, lying down and observing. Miracle occurs, as long as the Japanese army stands up, they will inevitably be shot and fall. What's going on? Colonel Zhang looked at the militia and shook his head repeatedly. Even if the Japanese devils stand still, these militia groups may not necessarily hit a single Japanese devil with 10 shots. Looking at other military intelligence agents, the accuracy of the shell-refuting pistol hitting the Japanese army in the distance is extremely low. Don't even think about it, they don't have the ability to shoot and kill a Japanese soldier with 1 shot. Is it the devil killed by the cook? How could it be? In Colonel Zhang's impression, the cook was like an idiot, thinking that bringing him here would make a big mistake. How could he have such precise marksmanship? Colonel Zhang looked towards Zhang Junhao and saw 7 or 8 Japanese soldiers lying on the ground, constantly firing guns. It's strange, why don't the Japanese rush towards the bushes? Faced with the attacks of 7 or 8 devils, why hasn't Zhang Junhao died yet? I should be too busy to take care of myself, how can I still have enough energy to eliminate the devils here? Of course, the Japanese who attacked Colonel Zhang's side were all killed by Zhang Junhao. The terrain of Zhang Junhao's location is complex, with shrubs and boulders everywhere. After Zhang Junhao hit somewhere, as long as he didn't shoot, the Japanese army would find it extremely difficult to detect him, which gave him enough time to take good aim. Zhang Junhao himself was not sure about the reason. His marksmanship was really damn good. Within 300 meters, As long as he calibrated the ruler, aimed well, took a breath, and gently pulled the trigger, he could easily hit 2 Japanese devils with 3 shots, and hit 100% within 100 meters. 7 or 8 Japanese devils who were close to themselves no longer dared to show their heads, but all hid themselves in rocks and grass, shooting indiscriminately. If they dared to look up and were discovered by Zhang Junhao, it was highly likely that their heads would explode. Zhang Junhao focused his shooting on attacking the Japanese army in the direction of the militia, and once he found any Japanese soldiers exposed in the shooting range, he would immediately fire. The feeling of sniping Japanese troops from a long distance is really amazing. Even if the Japanese army were to lie down, they could be killed by Zhang Junhao. Zhang Junhao had to give a thumbs up to the stability and accuracy of the 38th Great Cover. After excluding the influence of wind and terrain factors, the hit rate was extremely high. As long as Zhang Junhao is given a chance to focus and aim, it will be too difficult for the little devils who are locked by the sight to survive. Even if the little devils are moving, they cannot reduce Zhang Junhao's hit rate much. 20 minutes later, the Japanese army in the direction of attacking Colonel Li lay on the ground and no longer dared to move around. Zhang Junhao sneered in his heart. You have the ability to show off. What kind of Bushido spirit is hiding? Just as Zhang Junhao was carefully searching for targets to shoot at, a shell flew in and exploded violently. After that, large areas of soil, minerals, plants, and trees flew in like rain. Zhang Junhao quickly rolled around, left the shooting position, quickly climbed to a huge rock, pressed against the root of the rock, and hugged his head. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Why Assassinated Laozi? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Why Assassinated Laozi? After about 10 minutes of shelling, heavy machine gun bullets rained heavily. After shaking off the soil and clutter covering his body, Zhang Junhao quickly climbed along the bottom of the boulder to an observable spot. This sight startled Zhang Junhao, as many devils were rushing towards him from multiple directions. Although Zhang Junhao's brain was not enough, in the face of this situation, there was no need to think clearly. Unless he had an automatic weapon, he could not shoot the Japanese army from multiple directions together with the 38 large lids in his hand. Zhang Junhao believed that there was no need for him to stay in place and die. His goal of attracting the Japanese had already been achieved, and he had one time and space for Captain Li and his team to retreat. The person who knew the affairs was a hero, and he had to retreat immediately when it was time to do so. Without saying a word, Zhang Junhao stuffed the remaining grenade into his pocket, grabbed a bullet box with his left hand, and quickly ran towards the depths of the bushes with his gun in his right hand. Hand grenades are too precious, and putting them in his pocket has a significant negative impact on running, but Zhang Junhao will not throw them away unless absolutely necessary. After running for over 200 meters, Zhang Junhao leaned against a big tree and pressed his hands on his knees, panting fiercely. This run is too fierce and breathing is very urgent. You must take a break before continuing to run. The place where Zhang Junhao ambushed and shot echoed with the sound of grenade explosions and the sound of dense 38 large lids firing. Zhang Junhao hid behind a big tree and carefully observed that there were faint figures moving between the trees. Zhang Junhao raised the 38th Great Wall and wanted to eliminate a few more devils. The environment was too complex and there were too many obstacles, so there was no chance to aim. Zhang Junhao thought to himself, in order for Lieutenant Li and his team to have more time to evacuate, could we bring the Japanese over a distance? Zhang Junhao raised the muzzle of the gun, pulled the trigger, and with a loud bang, he grabbed the gun in both hands and ran up the mountain. Run, and after more than an hour, I ran into the deep mountains. There's no need to look back at all, Zhang Junhao knows there's no Japanese chasing after him. After climbing over a low hill, Zhang Junhao sat under a towering tree to rest. The sky began to drizzle again, and Zhang Junhao felt both cold and hungry. Because there is no sun, Zhang Junhao cannot determine the time. Zhang Junhao searched around, hoping to discover cooking smoke. He could go to the farmhouse to ask for some food and get some hot water to drink. The sky was gray, within sight, and there was smoke from cooking in areas without emission. Once he arrived at a safe place, he relaxed both physically and mentally. The hunger in his front and back made Zhang Junhao feel particularly uncomfortable, even suddenly feeling his legs weak and his eyelids fighting. "I really want to take a hot shower, have a big meal, and then lie down in the warm blanket to have a good night's sleep." Zhang Junhao looked up at the trees, some of which had flowers hanging on their branches. "It's late spring now, there can't be any edible wild fruits." Zhang Junhao gave up searching for wild fruits in the trees and lowered his head to find something to eat on the ground. Zhang Junhao cleared the rotten grass at the root of the tree and found edible mushrooms. Looking at the delicious mushrooms, Zhang Junhao sighed lightly. Mushrooms cannot be eaten raw. If eaten raw, it is seeking death. No matter how hungry he was, he couldn't eat mushrooms raw. Zhang Junhao had a clear mind and quickly left to resist the temptation of mushrooms. Zhang Junhao searched on the ground for a while and suddenly found a fallen and withered tree with a thick stem covered in boreholes. Intuition told him that food could be found inside the withered tree. Zhang Junhao took off his bayonet from his gun and chiseled open a withered tree. He found a large amount of white worms inside the tree, and immediately picked up the worms. He opened his mouth and threw them into his mouth. Most people wouldn't dare to eat this kind of bug raw even after killing it, but Zhang Junhao naturally started eating it raw. He didn't feel anything inappropriate, as if he used to eat these types of worms frequently, thinking that these white worms were natural and excellent proteins. After eating all the white worms in the withered tree, Zhang Junhao felt something in his stomach and felt much more comfortable all over. Zhang Junhao hung his bayonet upside down on the gun, with the gun on his back and shoulder. With his right hand, he grabbed the strap of the gun while also grabbing the bullet box, stabilizing the gun body. With his left hand, he grabbed the grenade and continued on his journey. At this moment, Zhang Junhao had only one thought and quickly found the militia. Being detached from the militia made Zhang Junhao feel so lonely. Zhang Junhao has a natural sense of responsibility. When the old squad leader asked him to escort American pilots, he thought it was necessary to complete the escort task. When the old squad leader wanted to bring all the civilian groups to the new 4th Army guerrilla team, he thought he had to help the old squad leader complete this task. Although Zhang Junhao couldn't figure out the nature of the new 4th Army, he naturally agreed and really wanted to become a member of the new 4th Army like the old squad leader. Zhang Junhao's memory began with the militia, and his memories before today's battle were extremely vague, leaving him in a state of confusion. Now I suddenly have thoughts, can think about problems, and have extremely strong hand and foot flexibility. I can do actions as I want. Before the war, Zhang Junhao sometimes had thoughts of doing certain actions, but his mind could not command his hands and feet, feeling that his mind was completely disconnected from his body. Although he couldn't recall anything from before in the militia, didn't know where he came from, where he was going, and didn't know why he was like a sharpshooter on the battlefield, as if he was naturally able to master the use of various weapons, Zhang Junhao was still very happy. After all, he thought he was just like a true person now. Zhang Junhao's brain is still unable to think more, thinking further. Zhang Junhao has only one idea now. Quickly find the militia and, together with the old squad leader, escort the US pilot to a safe place. Zhang Junhao was thinking while quickly walking north in the mountains. It is not easy to distinguish direction in the mountains, and most people will lose their way in the mountains. Especially in this kind of continuous rainy weather, the sun cannot show its face to help you distinguish direction. But Zhang Junhao has the ability to distinguish direction. He only needs to look up at the trees and branches to distinguish direction. In Zhang Junhao's view, the lush side of the branches is in the southeast direction, and the sparse vegetable side is in the northwest direction. He is going in the northeast direction, carrying the side with lush branches on his back, so he will definitely not go wrong. As he walked, the sky became darker. Although the rain stopped, Zhang Junhao's sense of direction became worse and worse because of the darkness. If you continue to drive after it's completely dark, getting lost is inevitable. Although Zhang Junhao doesn't know how to say things that go the other way, his intuition tells him that before it gets dark, he must find a place to stay. Firstly, find some food, and secondly, drink some hot water. Wait until dawn before continuing the journey. Let's go, let's go. Suddenly, there was a long object with a whoosh that swept its ear and flew over. Zhang Junhao was startled and stood with sweat all over his body. He quickly dodged behind a big tree, where an arrow was nailed not far behind him. The arrow was embedded in the tree and kept shaking. It's so close. Zhang Junhao quickly stuffed the bullet box and grenade into his pocket, and touched his ear with his right hand. He thought his ear had been shot by an arrow, but his ear felt itchy but not painful, and there was no blood on his hand. Only then did Zhang Junhao feel at ease. Zhang Junhao doesn't know who the person who shot the arrow at him is and why he shot the arrow at him. He felt very confused, thinking that the Japanese would not shoot arrows. Japanese devils can't shoot arrows, who can shoot arrows? Zhang Junhao held his gun in both hands, holding his breath and listening attentively. The forest was gloomy, as if archers were lurking everywhere. Rainwater dripped down from the tree and fell into Zhang Junhao's neck, leaving him motionless. Hormones are reaching their peak, and nerves are highly tense. On such a cold day, Zhang Junhao's palms are starting to sweat. If one naively thinks they are hiding well, but in fact they are completely exposed to the enemy's attack range, it will become a huge joke. It's really unfair to be shot dead by an inexplicable person with a bow and arrow in the desolate mountains and wilderness, despite not being killed by the little devils on the battlefield, which is shrouded in a barrage of bullets and artillery fire. Zhang Junhao glanced at the arrow nailed to the tree pole and speculated that the approximate position of the arrow shooter was on the extended line at the tail of the arrow. Zhang Junhao quickly glanced at the direction of the arrow tail extension line. 20 meters away, there was a crossbow next to a big tree. Zhang Junhao dared not observe it carefully and quickly turned back when he saw the crossbow. Fortunately, he shrank quickly. As soon as his head retracted, an arrow flew over. Zhang Junhao immediately jumped out to the left, with his back on the ground. While rolling, he extended his gun and his sharp eyes searched for the person who was shooting the arrow. His right index finger rested on the trigger, and once he saw the person clearly, he pulled the trigger and shot him. Ah! Chinese people. A big boy. The big boy is putting another arrow on the crossbow. It's so close. If Zhang Junhao's right index finger pulls the trigger, the big boy's chest will definitely be shot. When Zhang Junhao discovered that the person who was shooting the arrow was a big boy, he released his right index finger. Quickly flip over on the ground again, reach a stone, and lie on the ground. My waist was hit by a grenade, it hurt so much. Zhang Junhao took the grenade out of his pocket and grabbed it in his hand. Zhang Junhao was extremely angry and shouted, "Damn it, what are you doing? Why did you assassinate me?" End of this chapter. Chapter 6. The Good Things Your Grandfather Did. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. The Good Things Your Grandfather Did. What do you do? Do you work for Dongyang people? The big boy pointed his crossbow towards Zhang Junhao and shouted, pulling his throat. It can be heard that the tension level of the big boy far exceeds that of Zhang Junhao. Zhang Junhao breathed a sigh of relief and could hear that the other party was a boy, and not working for the Japanese devils. He sneered and said, "I killed the devils. What do you do?" Because Zhang Junhao was shot with a hidden arrow by the big boy, almost losing his life, and he almost shot the big boy himself. If Zhang Junhao didn't stop in time, the big boy would have turned into a dead person now. Zhang Junhao, who never used vulgar language, naturally started using it. "Are you the National Army?" Zhang Junhao was stunned. I am a militia, not the Nationalist Army, not even the new 4th Army guerrilla team. If it were a militia, would this dog day be looked up to? How about deceiving him into being a member of the National Army? Although Zhang Junhao's brain was still not working well and had no past memories, in this situation, he thought he had to deceive the boy, otherwise there would be no way to break the deadlock. Zhang Junhao exclaimed loudly, "Of course I am the Nationalist Army. The Japanese devils have come over. I have just fought and am currently on a secret mission. Please lower the crossbow for me, raise your hand, and roll out. Otherwise, I will treat you as a traitor and shoot you." "Don't shoot. I'm a mountain resident, I mistook you for a traitor. Damn it. I'll put down the crossbow and roll out." Zhang Junhao aimed his gun at the big boy and slowly stood up. The big boy lowered the crossbow and walked over with his hands raised high. Zhang Junhao carried his gun on his back, stuffed his hand into his pocket, and walked towards the big boy. The big boy is about 17 years old, less than 1.7 meters tall. At that time, in this place of Zhejiang, this tall boy was already tall. Weighing around 110 pounds, thin, with dark yellow skin and fluffy hair on the head. The tattered coarse cloth clothes had a black and dirty outer cover, and the leather jacket was in a mess. The big toes were exposed outside the cloth. After the two approached, Zhang Junhao looked down at the big boy from a high position. Zhang Junhao is 1.8 meters tall and weighs about 140 pounds, half a head taller than the big boy. Zhang Junhao does have the momentum to crush the big boy. Zhang Junhao stared into the big boy's eyes and sternly said, "Damn it, who the hell are you? How could you be here? Why did you shoot a secret arrow at me?" The big boy's eyes were filled with tears, and he choked up as he told Zhang Junhao that this afternoon, more than 30 foreign devils suddenly came to his house. They ordered their grandpa to be their guide, but grandpa refused. The Eastern devils tied him and his sister to a tree and threatened grandpa by killing them. Grandpa had to agree to serve as a guide for the Japanese devils in order to save him and his sister. The Dongyan devils arrested their younger sister, saying it was to prevent grandpa from leading them the wrong way. "If you take the wrong route, you will make your sister a comfort woman." The big boy said that he only recently broke free from his bondage. The first time he broke free from his bondage, he wanted to save his grandfather and sister. The big boy said that after discovering Zhang Junhao, he thought he was working for the Eastern devils and wanted to kill him. Zhang Junhao quickly asked, "Which direction did the little devil go?" The big boy pointed northeast. "Ah." Zhang Junhao was greatly surprised, "Not good. Which group of devils are trying to take a shortcut to ambush and escort the US pilot team?" After looking in the northeast direction for a while, Zhang Junhao whispered, "The devils also need to eat and rest. I estimate they will sleep in the mountainous area tonight. Get me some food, dry my clothes over fire, and let me rest. After I recover my strength, you can be my guide. Let's chase the devils overnight and find a way to save your grandfather and sister." The big boy was overjoyed and said with tears in his eyes, "Thank you very much, Mr. Boss. My house is nearby, and I will take you to eat and have a barbecue." The big boy's name is Wang Jingxian. His parents joined Yujishi's 74th Army many years ago. During the Chinese New Year, his father even sent a letter back, saying that he had become the commander of the main force and had made many military achievements in the anti-Japanese battlefield. "My father wants him to be Yu Wumu and be loyal to the country. I will also join the National Army next year and kill the Japanese like my father." Zhang Junhao frowned, feeling that he had heard of the 74th Army. Upon careful consideration, his hair was swollen and he couldn't remember anything. Zhang Junhao's memory began with the Mintuan. Everything before the Mintuan was like drinking alcohol in fragments, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't remember it for a while. Truly sober was on the battlefield not long ago, and all the situations since waking up are vividly remembered. At the big boy's house, Zhang Junhao sat on the root of a tree under the stove and occasionally stuffed a piece of wood into the stove. The stove was blazing, and hot air emanated from his body. The big boy was cooking on the stove while constantly talking to Zhang Junhao. It can be heard that the big boy is most proud of his father. The grandfather of the big boy was a scholar from the late Qing dynasty. Decades ago, due to the trouble of growing hair, the grandfather used a basket to carry the big boy's father and books and fled from Huzhou to come here. Grandpa cultivated land, harvested herbs, and hunted to support his family. The big boy's father grew up and married a mother, giving birth to him and his sister. After my father and mother joined the army, the big boy and sister lived with my grandfather all the time. My grandfather taught them how to read and read. The big boy usually follows his grandfather into the mountains to pick herbs and hunt. Zhang Junhao was not very interested in the situation at the big boy's house. He was extremely tired and relaxed, feeling warm and drowsy from the stove. As soon as he closed his eyes, he fell asleep. Upon waking up, the big boy had already cooked the food, and the clothes Zhang Junhao was wearing had also been dried. I stewed a wild chicken, fried a bowl of leeks and a bowl of eggs with black fungus. Zhang Junhao and the big boy wolfed down the food on the table like remnants of a storm. Because he was too hungry, Zhang Junhao didn't care about his eating habits. And because he was about to rescue the big boy's grandfather and sister, Zhang Junhao thought it was only natural to eat the food from the big boy's house. After having a full meal, the big boy filled a gourd with boiling water, filled a thick bamboo tube with rice, tied the gourd and the bamboo tube at both ends with hemp rope, and hung it around his neck. Carrying a leather bag filled with bamboo arrows on his back, he lifted the crossbow and eagerly awaited Zhang Junhao. Zhang Junhao calmly sharpened a thick bamboo stick with a bayonet, propped it against a rag, cleaned the gun barrel, wiped the dirt off the gun with the rag, and then stuffed the rag into the muzzle. Zhang Junhao did these movements naturally and appeared very professional. The straw shoes on Zhang Junhao's feet were tattered. Without seeking the consent of the big boy, he took off the tattered straw shoes and put on a new pair of straw shoes hanging on the wall. Zhang Junhao lifted the 38 big lid and looked at the big boy, whispering, "Are you afraid of death?" The big boy nodded and shook his head. Zhang Junhao took a deep breath and whispered, "The devils are well trained, numerous in number, and equipped with advanced weapons. When my team fought against the devils, many people died, and of course, I also killed many devils. Let's go rescue your grandfather and sister, it's like hitting a stone with a chicken egg. Prepare to die together." The big boy bit his lips tightly and nodded hard. Zhang Junhao shouted, "Let's go." Zhang Junhao and the big boy left the lonely stone house in the deep mountains and walked into the darkness. Following the mountain road, the dark clouds in the sky gradually dissipated, and the visible distance reached over 100 meters. Zhang Junhao and the big boy didn't speak to each other, and there was a vague feeling around them, as if there were wandering ghosts and spirits. After walking about 20 miles with the big boy, Zhang Junhao suddenly faintly heard the sound of gunfire. Zhang Junhao stood still, involuntarily holding his gun in his hand. The sky above a small hill occasionally flashed with light. The big boy was startled and asked in a low voice, "Is there a war over there?" Zhang Junhao sneered and gritted his teeth, saying, "What your grandfather did. My team may have been attacked by Japanese invaders." End of this chapter. Chapter 7. A Person's Battle. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. A Person's Battle. Zhang Junhao and the big boy cautiously approached the Japanese army along the mountainside. On a huge rock, covered by branches, Zhang Junhao and the little boy stood and looked down. There were 4 or 5 small villages on the hillside, with guns on fire all around. The attacking team had 2 machine guns and 2 grenade launchers. The sound of gunfire in the village was sparse, with the sound of shell guns. Based on the sound of shell guns, Zhang Junhao could infer that the militia was surrounded by the Japanese. Zhang Junhao wished he could immediately rush into the village and fight alongside the old squad leader. Zhang Junhao stared at the big boy with a fierce and malevolent expression, gritting his teeth and cursing, "Damn it, your grandfather should be shot." The big boy was stunned and instantly blushed, his neck thick. Zhang Junhao let out a heavy sigh and lowered his voice, saying, "We would rather die in battle than rescue the troops surrounded by the devils." The big boy nodded with tears in his eyes. Zhang Junhao and the big boy got into the bushes and touched the bottom of the mountain. After arriving at a high ground, looking down at the foot of the mountain, there were 2 or 3 houses and guns on fire in the yard. The ghosts around were only 100 meters away from the houses, with no signs of approaching. The Japanese army occasionally fired 1 or 2 shells from their grenade launchers, and their machine guns stuttered intermittently, with occasional grenade explosions. Zhang Junhao breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that the Japanese army did not launch a strong attack, but rather wanted to drag down the troops in the village. If the Japanese army wanted to launch a strong attack, they could simply use a grenade launcher to destroy the house, or approach and throw grenades into the house. Zhang Junhao couldn't understand the Japanese tactics. Zhang Junhao continued and arrived only 300 meters away from the Japanese army. He lay in a thicket and extended his gun to observe. "We can only attack the Japanese army in a small area and must continue to approach." Zhang Junhao said to the big boy, "We have to go down and get closer to the fight." The big boy trembled and said, "Okay. Okay." Zhang Junhao sneered and asked, "Is the crotch wet?" The big boy lowered his head and ground it with his toes. It is inevitable to be afraid when you first go to the battlefield, not to mention the big boy, even Zhang Junhao is extremely nervous. Stay away from the Japanese army and shoot, relatively safe. If you get close and hit, you'll just pin your head on your waistband and you could be killed by the Japanese army at any time. Zhang Junhao arched his body and continued to touch, while the little boy followed closely, breathing extremely urgently. After arriving only a few dozen meters away from the Japanese army, Zhang Junhao found a shrub and lay down, whispering to the big boy, "Find your own target and shoot arrows. Be sure to pay attention to safety." The big boy extended his crossbow to aim at a Japanese soldier. Zhang Junhao shook hands with thunder in his right hand and pulled a pull ring in his left hand. After smashing it on a stone, he immediately threw it at 5 or 6 Japanese soldiers who were focused together. After throwing the grenade, before it could explode, Zhang Junhao aimed his gun at a Japanese machine gunner. With a loud explosion, he fired and the Japanese machine gunner was hit in the head and lay down. Zhang Junhao fired consecutive shots, but after all the bullets were shot, he flipped his body and lay on his back, pressing the bullets into the barrel. Unfortunately, it's not an automatic rifle. Not even a magazine. Zhang Junhao sighed in his heart as he pressed the bullet. "If I have an assault rifle in my hand and sufficient ammunition, I dare to rush into the midst of the devils and kill them in pain." This idea suddenly came to mind, and Zhang Junhao felt extremely strange. How could there be an assault rifle in his impression? What's going on here? Unable to think about it, it's like fishing for light and shadow in the air. After the 5 bullets were loaded into the barrel, Zhang Junhao quickly flipped his body and fired at the Japanese army. Only 5 bullets can be loaded into the gun barrel, and soon all the bullets will run out. Zhang Junhao pressed the bullet into the barrel again. While pressing the bullet, Zhang Junhao observed the big boy. This observation made Zhang Junhao couldn't help but give him a thumbs up, as he happened to see the big boy shooting a ghost with a crossbow. The arrow struck devil covered his chest with both hands and rolled on the ground, shouting wildly. Zhang Junhao said to the big boy, "Climb aside and find a hidden place to shoot a cold arrow. Don't expose it." The big boy nodded repeatedly. Zhang Junhao watched the big boy move about 30 meters to one side and lay down in the grass, feeling that the position was very good. Stop caring about the big boy and extend the gun that has been loaded with bullets again, ready to shoot. At this moment, a series of bullets hit, and Zhang Junhao knew that he had been exposed. After thinking for a moment, he grabbed the magazine and ran towards the side away from the big boy. After reaching a huge rock, he extended his gun and fired at the Japanese army. As long as he is detected by the Japanese army, Zhang Junhao will immediately transfer, basically firing 5 bullets and changing places. Zhang Junhao was no more than 50 meters away from the Japanese army, and he was extremely brave. Fortunately, the terrain in this area is extremely complex, with shrubs, weeds, and rocks everywhere, and there are many hidden places. In a state of panic, the Japanese army found it difficult to target Zhang Junhao. And Zhang Junhao's accuracy is extremely high. As long as he shoots, he can hit the Japanese. Most of the devils who have a clear understanding of Zhang Junhao's location do not live long. Zhang Junhao was prepared for sacrifice. Although all his past memories were lost, it did not affect his determination to fight the Japanese army to the end. The Japanese army was obviously caught off guard, and in less than half an hour, more than 10 Japanese soldiers were killed. I thought there were too many gunmen lurking on the mountain and didn't dare to rush up. This Japanese commander is a senior special agent of the Japanese Hangzhou Secret Service, and his task is to arrest American pilots. During the day, the Japanese army failed to capture the American pilot, which made Lieutenant Yamashita extremely angry. He personally rushed to the 70th Division, which had already occupied Xinjiang, and mobilized more than 30 elite Japanese troops, led by experienced Lieutenant Ikeda, to enter the mountainous area to take shortcuts, intercept and escort the American pilot team. When passing by the big boy's house, in order to prevent getting lost, he threatened to kill the big boy and his sister and forced the big boy's grandfather to guide them. As soon as Lieutenant Wu led his team out of the mountainous area, he was spotted by the sentinels of the escorting American pilots who had entered the village one step earlier than them. The two squadrons immediately opened fire on each other. Xiao Xia ordered the team to surround the village, but in order to prevent major casualties, Xiao Xia did not order the team to rush in. He thought that escorting the American pilot team had very little ammunition, and as long as he lured them to shoot, it wouldn't be long before the ammunition for escorting the American pilot team would be depleted. After dawn, let the team charge in to eliminate the escort of American pilots and capture them alive. To the surprise of Lieutenant Yamashita, a grenade suddenly flew down from the mountain, and with a loud bang, it killed Lieutenant Ikeda and the translator in charge of the specific command. His own shoulder was also scratched by shrapnel. Xiaozhua Yamashita was instantly stunned by the explosion, as this team was temporarily drawn in and he didn't even know a sergeant. As he watched the Japanese army constantly fall, he became disorganized and could only catch one of them. He was ordered to shoot at the mountain. Not long after, more than 10 Japanese soldiers were killed by cold guns and arrows fired from the mountains. Shanxia Xiaozhua was hiding behind a huge rock, urgently considering countermeasures. Half of the people had already died in battle. What should be done next? Lieutenant Colonel Yamashita gave up the idea of attacking the village, because even if he caught the American pilot, it was impossible to safely capture them with these dozen or so soldiers. After thinking for a while, Colonel Yamashita decided to focus on dealing with the National Army on the mountain. He personally ran over and transferred 2 grenade launchers and a light machine gun, only allowing a few Japanese soldiers with rifles to shoot against the village team. In the eyes of the young lieutenant at the foot of the mountain, his biggest enemy is on the mountain. As long as he can eliminate the enemies on the mountain, the people in the village will become turtles in a jar and can definitely be caught. The Japanese 70th Division has captured Xinjiang and can be killed tomorrow noon. The regular army of the Nationalist Army is retreating at full speed, and it is impossible for any troops to come and reinforce. Colonel Yamashita stood behind the grenade launcher and machine gun, raised his commanding knife and shouted, "Shoot the mountain." End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Saving Flower Girl. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8 Saving Flower Girl. A shell landed just in front of Zhang Junhao not far away. Zhang Junhao was fortunate enough to lie down in time, otherwise he would have been killed by the explosion. Zhang Junhao's head was buzzing and his ears were deaf. After shaking off the gravel and soil on his body, Zhang Junhao quickly ran towards the big boy. Although the Japanese army fired indiscriminately and fired at the foot of the mountain, due to the small impact area of the Japanese army, with one shell fired to the east and one shell fired to the west, it was possible that one shell would fall beside them. Zhang Junhao thought he couldn't stay on the mountain anymore, so he decided to bring the big boy into the village and join the team. He asked the team to quickly break out of the enclosure and evacuate. After Zhang Junhao found the big boy, he only shouted, "Let's enter the village," and immediately ran up the mountain, with the big boy following Zhang Junhao. Zhang Junhao ran a large arc route, avoiding the area hit by Japanese shells, and ran towards the village. As he approached the village, Zhang Junhao lay behind a big tree and fired at several Japanese soldiers who were shooting at the village. The first shot hit a devil's head, the second shot hit a devil's shoulder, and the rest of the devil quickly retreated in fear. The old squad leader's shout came from the village, "Junhao, come over quickly." Zhang Junhao's ears had regained their hearing, but he did not respond. Instead, he led the big boy and aimed his gun at the direction of the Japanese army, preparing to shoot at any time while slowly retreating towards the old squad leader's house. The big boy also pointed his crossbow towards the direction of the Japanese army, learning from Zhang Junhao's method, and retreated towards the house. When Zhang Junhao arrived at the gate of the courtyard, the old class monitor reached out and pulled Zhang Junhao inside. The big boy followed in. Without waiting for the old squad leader to speak, Zhang Junhao loudly said, "There are no Japanese troops on the north side of the village. Quickly evacuate from that direction." The old squad leader nodded repeatedly and said, "Okay. I'll tell Lieutenant Li about this right away." Zhang Junhao lay on the wall, searching for the Japanese army. The old class monitor ran into the room. The Japanese army still fired indiscriminately on the mountain. Colonel Zhang from the Military Statistics Bureau came to Zhang Junhao's side and whispered, "Junhao, is it really you who fought against the Japanese army on the mountain?" Zhang Junhao stood at attention with a standard military salute and loudly said yes. Although Zhang Junhao's clothes were worn out and damp, and he wore grass shoes on his feet, he stood straight and had standardized military salute movements. Colonel Zhang couldn't help but be stunned. Is this Zhang Junhao a student of the principal? Colonel Zhang couldn't help but stand still and salute the military. Colonel Zhang from the Military Statistics Bureau asked curiously, "Which military academy did you graduate from?" Zhang Junhao said truthfully, "Report to Major, it may be due to the war, I have forgotten all about the past." Colonel Zhang from the Military Statistics Bureau observed Zhang Junhao from top to bottom, with a confused expression on his face. He nodded and said, "The cook of the militia is a fool." Zhang Junhao smiled but didn't speak. Colonel Zhang raised his hand and patted Zhang Junhao's shoulder, saying loudly, "No matter what your background is, you have saved us again. Your combat experience and abilities are extremely outstanding, and I appreciate them very much. Join our military statistics." Zhang Junhao whispered, "I'm just a militia." Colonel Zhang smiled and didn't say anything more. Captain Li and the old squad leader came together. Captain Li said to the old squad leader, "You and Zhang Junhao go behind and cover us." The old class monitor nodded and agreed. There are still 3 members left in the Military Statistics Bureau, one of whom is carrying a radio station on his back. There are still 6 members left in the militia, including Captain Li and the senior squad leader. 3 American pilots were unharmed, and they also carried 38 large-lidded rifles, apparently participating in the battle. When American pilots passed by Zhang Junhao, they all gave him a thumbs up. When Major Zhang passed by, he said, "It's not far from the temporary 9th Army Defense Zone. We'll be safe soon. We'll be away for about half an hour, and you'll catch up. After leaving the village, the team ran rapidly northward. Zhang Junhao, the old squad leader, and the big boy were lying on a small high ground on the roadside, closely monitoring the direction of the village. The big boy said to Zhang Junhao, "Boss, promise me to save my grandfather and sister." Zhang Junhao sternly said, "How can we save them? I don't even know where they are." Zhang Junhao didn't want to save the grandfather and sister of the big boy. He thought it was the grandfather of the big boy who led the Japanese army towards the village, and he deserved his death. Just now, during the war with the Japanese army, I didn't care about the life and death of the big boy's grandfather and sister at all. The big boy choked up and said, "If you don't save grandpa and sister, I'll go save them." The old class monitor looked at Zhang Junhao, frowned, and whispered, "What's going on?" Zhang Junhao said angrily, "You ask him." The big boy whispered, "Grandpa and sister have been kidnapped by the Japanese." After thinking for a moment, the old class monitor lowered his head and said to Zhang Junhao, "Let's go rescue them together." Zhang Junhao sighed and said, "Our mission is to escort American pilots." The old squad leader raised his hand and lightly patted Zhang Junhao's back, whispering, "Junhao, what is the purpose of our fight against the Japanese? Ultimately, it's to protect the people. Listen to me, let's go save them." Zhang Junhao pouted and sighed heavily, saying, "Okay. I obey orders." The sky is already dawn. The old class monitor walked at the front, Zhang Junhao walked at the second, the big boy walked at the back, and the three of them walked through the forest, quickly touching the south side of the village. The Japanese army has gathered together, leaving only 10 people, 2 of whom were seriously injured. The spy agency's lieutenant colonel at the foot of the mountain is speaking to the Japanese army with a bandage wrapped around his left arm. Colonel Yamashita said, "After American bombers bombed mainland Japan, they flew to China. In order to prevent the Chinese and American air forces from using airports in the Zhejiang region of China to carry out shuttle bombing on mainland Japan, the headquarters ordered China to dispatch a large army with the aim of defeating enemies in Zhejiang province, destroying their main aviation bases, and thwarting the enemy's attempts to bomb the imperial mainland in the area. The headquarters demanded that we capture all American pilots alive, bring them back for trial, and severely punish them. Several American pilots have been arrested and have been tried and severely punished. Now, these 3 American pilots are under the protection of the Chinese military, attempting to escape to Tsuzhou Airport. We were heavily injured by the Chinese military during the capture of American pilots, resulting in significant casualties. I contacted the headquarters and reported the situation. The headquarters informed me that there are currently 9 Chinese troops ahead, instructing us to temporarily abandon the capture operation. After the 70th and 22nd Divisions of the Kono Mixed Brigade arrive, we will reorganize our stronger troops and continue to capture American pilots with the cooperation of the Army. This place is not far from the temporary 9th Army of the Chinese Army. Everyone should remain highly vigilant to prevent the Chinese Army from launching surprise attacks. Everyone rest in place and wait for the arrival of the 70th Division. After Xiao Xia finished speaking, the Japanese army rested in place. Lieutenant Yamashita brought 2 Japanese soldiers to a nearby forest, and the big boy's grandfather and sister were tied to the tree trunk. Colonel Yamashita came to the front of the big boy's grandfather, raised his command knife with his right hand, and viciously slashed down at him. Colonel Yamashita came to the big boy and sister, who were stuffed with rags in their mouths and struggling with tears. The young sergeant at the foot of the mountain glared at the big boy and sister, put his bleeding commanding knife to the big boy and sister's chin, and said, "All the people in should be dead." The young sergeant at the foot of the mountain drew back his commanding knife and said to 2 Japanese soldiers, "This flower girl is very beautiful. It's a pity to kill her directly. I will give you a chance to play. After playing, you will kill her for me." 2 Japanese soldiers were overjoyed and quickly stood up, shouting, "Hi!" loudly. The young lieutenant took a few steps to the side, leaning against a big tree and pondering. Two Japanese soldiers, you look at me and I look at you. After hesitating for a while, they immediately showed a fierce smile on their faces and rushed towards the big boy and sister who were being tied up together. Just then, two gunshots suddenly rang out. One of the Japanese soldiers was shot in the back of their head, while the other was hit in the back of their heart. Two Japanese soldiers immediately fell in front of the big boy and sister. The young lieutenant at the foot of the mountain was so scared that he lost his soul. He quickly stumbled and fled to the resting Japanese soldiers. The one who fired these two shots is Zhang Junhao and the other is the old squad leader. They arrived very timely. If they were a little late, the big boy's sister would suffer. Zhang Junhao and the old squad leader chased after the young lieutenant, and the big boy quickly went over to untie his sister. The Japanese soldiers who were resting immediately fell to the ground and fired at Zhang Junhao and the old squad leader when they heard gunshots. Zhang Junhao and the old squad leader were forced to hide under trees and fought back. Zhang Junhao and the old class leader retreated to the tree where the big boy and sister were tied, and the big boy tried to untie the rope that tied his grandfather's body. Zhang Junhao quickly searched for the bodies of Japanese soldiers, found two boxes filled with bullets, handed one to the old squad leader, and then went to the big boy's place. Zhang Junhao said to the big boy, "Death cannot be resurrected. Even if the rope is untied, we cannot take him away." The old class monitor walked over and helped the big boy, urging him to leave quickly. Zhang Junhao asked the big boy and sister if they could leave. The big boy and sister collapsed and fainted. Zhang Junhao lifted the big boy and sister onto his shoulder and said to the old class monitor, "Hurry up. If it's too slow, we won't be able to leave." In one breath, he ran several hundred meters and arrived at the small highland. Zhang Junhao placed the big boy and sister on the ground. At this moment, the big boy and sister had woken up leisurely. The big boy and his sister hugged each other and cried bitterly. After looking for a while, Zhang Junhao sighed heavily and said, "Don't cry, we still have to catch up with the team. You go home quickly." The big boy lifted his tearful eyes and looked at Zhang Junhao, choking up and saying, "I want to kill the devils with you." Zhang Junhao shook his head and said, "You are a common people, and you have no obligation to kill the devils. Hurry up and leave with your sister." The big boy looked at the old class monitor and said, "Boss, my dad and mom are fighting the Japanese in the 74th Army. I want to fight the Japanese with you." The old class monitor asked softly, "What will your sister do?" The big boy and sister looked up and said loudly, "I also want to fight the Japanese and avenge my grandfather." End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Being regarded by siblings as the closest and closest person. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Being regarded by siblings as the closest and closest person, Zhang Junhao lay on a small highland, closely monitoring the direction of the village. The big boy and his sister were lying next to Zhang Junhao, begging him to take them with him. The old class monitor said that as long as Zhang Junhao agrees, they can be brought along. So the siblings firmly stuck to Zhang Junhao after hearing this and insisted on his consent. Zhang Junhao is very upset. He doesn't even know what he will do in the future. How can he have the spare time to manage these two siblings? The big boy and sister are very weak and must go through rest before they can walk. If you take her, you can only carry her on your back. Although the big boy is full of strength, he is still young and cannot carry his sister. Zhang Junhao looked at the big boy and whispered, "Our mission is to escort American pilots, and we still need to walk hundreds of miles. The Japanese won't easily let us go, and soon more troops will gather to chase us. We may go to war with the Japanese at any time, including myself, and we could all die in battle. You still find a way to escape to a safe place and follow us, sooner or later you will be killed by the Japanese." The big boy looked serious and said, "My sister and I have discussed that we should be Uwumu and kill the devils." The big boy and sister quickly said, "Yes. I also want to be Yuwumu and kill the devils. Zhang Junhao looked at the big boy and sister and asked with a bitter smile, "Little girl, do you have the strength to walk now?" The big boy and sister lowered their heads and whispered, "When I was tied to a tree, the Japanese hit me in the stomach with a stock and even slapped me in the mouth. My head was still a bit dizzy and I didn't have any strength all over." Zhang Junhao sighed and said, "The devils are all animals." Zhang Junhao looked at the bamboo tube hanging around the big boy's neck and whispered, "Take out the rice, everyone eat." The big boy quickly took off the bamboo tube. 4 people use their hands to pick up rice from the bamboo tube to eat, and at this time, no one pays attention to hygiene. After eating the rice in the bamboo tube, Zhang Junhao was only half full. Everyone drinks water from the gourd, you take a sip, he takes a sip, and no one cares whether someone else's mouth is clean or not. The Japanese army did not chase after them. After discussing with the old class monitor for a few words, Zhang Junhao decided to catch up with the team. The big boy and sister's name is Wang Jinhui, who is 15 years old and extremely handsome and lovely. They were beaten badly by the Japanese and suffered severe internal injuries. Seeing their grandfather being killed by the Japanese, they suffered great psychological trauma. While sobbing and eating, their whole body was still soft and weak, and Zhang Junhao could only carry her on his back. The big boy carried a gun for Zhang Junhao. Along the way, Wang Jinhui kept whispering in Zhang Junhao's ear, asking him to kill the Japanese who used a knife to strike his grandfather. What can Zhang Junhao say? When he rushed to the forest with the old squad leader, he did not find the ghost. When he found it, the ghost had already escaped with the help of the forest cover. If he had discovered it at the time, how could he have been given a chance to escape? If Zhang Junhao knew that the Japanese spy was one of the most important spies in Hangzhou, he would have to chase him down. Leaving such people behind will bring endless troubles. But so far I don't know. Zhang Junhao escorted a U.S. military pilot who was seriously injured, saved Wang Jinhui, and found out that her grandfather had died. Naturally, the first thing he thought of was to evacuate quickly. As for avenging Wang Jinhui, Zhang Junhao never thought about it. In Zhang Junhao's eyes, Wang Jinhui was just an ordinary little girl, not a relative, and it was unprecedented to be able to carry her away. Her grandfather is also an ordinary farmer. There are so many Chinese people killed by the Japanese devils, and Zhang Junhao cannot avenge them one by one. Besides, why? Where does he have the obligation to avenge them? Zhang Junhao belongs to people without a past. He talks to him about morality and empty truths, which he cannot understand. Zhang Junhao only listened to the old class monitor's words, because the old class monitor had cared for him meticulously before. Without the old class monitor, there would be no Zhang Junhao today. Zhang Junhao really wants to join the guerrilla forces of the new Fourth Army and continue to fight the Japanese with the old squad leader after completing the mission of escorting American pilots. Can I call you Big Brother? Wang Jinhui asked. Zhang Junhao sighed and said, "Are you bothering me? Keep nagging, I'll leave you behind." Zhang Junhao really got angry. There is a great possibility of letting go of Wang Jinhui. She walked with a weight of dozens of pounds on her back, feeling very tired. "I haven't slept for 2 days or nights, and my eyelids are fighting. How can I feel better? The road ahead is long, and there may be another war at some point." Wang Jinhui pouted, angry, but helpless. Wang Jinhui's body was extremely weak, and once he didn't speak, he quickly fell asleep in a daze. At noon, Zhang Junhao and his team finally caught up with the escort team of American pilots. Everyone was so hungry that they were dizzy and couldn't even move their feet. After discussing with Lieutenant Zhang and Lieutenant Li, the team entered a village to demand food from the villagers. In a wealthy family, the team was warmly welcomed. Colonel Zhang asked the reporter to send a report to the headquarters and requested nearby teams to come and pick it up. Headquarters replied, immediately contact the temporary 9th Army, please send troops to respond. Upon learning that a team would come to pick him up soon, Zhang Junhao was very happy and relaxed. He sat on the bench against the wall and fell asleep in a daze. Wang Jingxian and Wang Jinhui sat next to Zhang Junhao, one on the left and one on the right, closely adjacent to him. These two siblings are very strange. They have known Zhang Junhao for such a short period of time, and even consider him the closest person. They only trust Zhang Junhao, and they are determined to follow him to fight the Japanese and avenge their grandfather. They found that after Zhang Junhao fell asleep, he stopped talking and sat quietly. After talking to the host, Colonel Zhang came to Zhang Junhao and looked at him, eager to persuade him to join the Military Statistics Bureau. Colonel Zhang thought that after handing over the U.S. pilot to the temporary 9th Army, he had completed the escort mission and could return to Hangzhou. Most of the military intelligence agents who came with him have died in battle, and there is a great need for fresh blood input. Colonel Zhang greatly admires Zhang Junhao's skills. Although Zhang Junhao does not understand espionage work, it does not affect that he is a rare talent. Colonel Zhang watched Zhang Junhao for a while and couldn't bear to disturb his sleep. He swallowed 1,000 words and wanted to take Zhang Junhao away directly after completing the task of escorting American pilots with the temporary 9th Army. The old class monitor sat not far away, looking at Major Zhang and Zhang Junhao with furrowed brows. How clever is he? He guessed that Major Zhang was interested in Zhang Junhao's attempt to take him away. The old squad leader was very anxious. If Colonel Zhang were to take Zhang Junhao away, it would be a significant loss for the new 4th Army guerrilla forces. How can Zhang Junhao not be taken away? The old squad leader couldn't come up with a solution. After all, he was just a small militia squad leader. How could he be compared to a major in the Military Statistics Bureau? Besides, only Zhang Junhao knows the true identity of the old squad leader. He is in a hidden state and his identity must not be exposed. The old class monitor can only take advantage of the situation, but cannot forcefully obstruct it. Colonel Zhang nodded to the siblings Wang Jingxian and Wang Jinhui before turning around and leaving. Captain Li sat down next to the old squad leader and whispered, "What's going on with Zhang Junhao?" The old class monitor asked curiously, "What do you want to ask?" Captain Li glanced at Zhang Junhao and whispered, "He's just a cook, he's a fool. Why is the war so fierce? Without him, we might all have died." The old squad leader sighed and said, "Zhang Junhao's background is extremely mysterious. He has lost his memory and knows nothing about the past. This person may be a regular military officer who suffered a serious head injury on the battlefield and has forgotten everything about the past." The old squad leader wanted to bring Lieutenant Li to the new 4th Army guerrilla team, so naturally when talking about Zhang Junhao, he couldn't hide it. Captain Li nodded and said, "I see, it seems that his body has basically recovered." The old class monitor nodded and said, "Yeah. It's been dozens of miles. I've been carrying that little girl on my back all along, she's naturally divine." Captain Li nodded and said, "It's amazing. We treated him unfairly in the past, and from now on, we can't let him become a cook anymore." Lunch was very sumptuous, and Zhang Junhao ate a lot. After eating, he asked Wang Jingxian to fill the bamboo tube with rice. After lunch, everyone continued to rest. In the afternoon, a regiment of the 9th Army arrived temporarily, with the regiment leader's surname Zhao. After Captain Zhao arrived, he immediately held a military meeting to deploy defense against the Japanese attack. Major Zhang attended the meeting, and Zhang Junhao and others moved to the backyard of this household to continue their rest. After the meeting, Captain Zhao's team immediately built fortifications in battalions 2 to 3 kilometers away from the village. The headquarters of the regiment is temporarily located in this household. Colonel Zhang asked Captain Zhao how to escort American pilots away. Captain Zhao looked at Major Zhang with a bitter smile and said, "Major, our 9th Army needs to resist the attack of a Japanese division in a brigade for the time being. There are not as many cannons in a single army as there are in a single Japanese regiment, and the guns are all medium to standard. There are not many heavy machine guns, so how can we draw troops to escort them? The Japanese first team will arrive within 2 hours, and the military headquarters wants us to hold on until tomorrow noon. That's it. First, stay with the regimental headquarters. After we complete the interception task, take action together with the regimental headquarters." Colonel Zhang looked south and sighed heavily, saying, "The Japanese 70th Division came from Fenghua, and the High Mixed Brigade came from Shangyu, Shaoxing. If the two Japanese armies converge, the task of the temporary 9th Army is indeed very heavy." Captain Zhao sighed and said, "We can only use our flesh and blood to resist the steel flood of the Japanese army. Every inch of rivers and mountains, every inch of blood, we can only compete with the Japanese army. Since you are very clear about the situation, I would like to remind you that even if I can escort American pilots to Dongyang, I may not be able to avoid the pursuit of the Japanese army. There are also Japanese troops coming from Hangzhou in that area. With my regiment, you will actually be safer." Colonel Zhang nodded and said, "Let me contact the headquarters and listen to their opinions before making a decision." End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Hand-to-hand fighting to seize the field. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Hand-to-hand fighting to seize the field. Zhang Junhao and others were resting on straw in a room. The south is currently under continuous artillery fire, and Captain Zhao's troops are engaged in battle with the Japanese army. The room was occasionally illuminated by flashes of artillery fire, and the violent explosion of the shells shook the house uncontrollably. Zhang Junhao was aware that the Japanese army had fired heavy artillery, and Captain Zhao's troops encountered the main force of the Japanese army. The atmosphere inside the room is extremely tense. When the shell explodes, the militia will tremble with fear. Wang Jinhui snuggled tightly against Zhang Junhao, as if she was safe as long as she was with him. Wang Jingxian was also very scared, his eyes wide open, and he looked extremely frightened. 3 American pilots sat back to back together, chattering and saying something that Zhang Junhao couldn't understand. Lieutenant Li and the old squad leader sat together, their expressions extremely solemn, listening with their ears perked up and not speaking. Zhang Junhao lay back with his eyes open, motionless, feeling so small and helpless. In the face of battle-level battles, people like him, no matter how strong their personal abilities are as helpless as babies. Fear cannot save lives, but not being afraid is self-deception. Fear is innate. Zhang Junhao would also be afraid. "Big brother, will we die?" Wang Jinhui suddenly asked in a low voice. Zhang Junhao heard Wang Jinhui call him big brother, which was very pleasant. Wang Jingxian is his own brother, named Zhang Junhao big brother, which can distinguish Zhang Junhao from Wang Jingxian. Zhang Junhao nodded and said, "Anyone will die. Many people must have died on the front line." Wang Jinhui trembled all over and whispered, "When I die, I want to be with you." Zhang Junhao sighed heavily and said, "If a shell falls beside you, it will blow people to pieces." To be honest, Zhang Junhao's thinking ability was still very limited, and he did not consider that saying so would scare Wang Jinhui. Wang Jinhui was so scared that he hugged Zhang Junhao even harder. Zhang Junhao turned to look at Wang Jingxian and whispered, "I estimate that Captain Zhao's defense line may be breached by the Japanese army. At that time, Captain Zhao will order all those who can wield weapons to go to the battlefield and reclaim the lost positions." Wang Jingxian nodded and said, "Big brother, I'll call you like my sister. I'll follow you then. I'll die on the battlefield, and I'll be Yu Wumu." Zhang Junhao nodded and said, "Great. We all need to be prepared for sacrifice." Wang Jingxian nodded and said, "Okay." Zhang Junhao is indeed ready to sacrifice at any time. He knows that on the battlefield, guns and artillery have no eyes, and anyone could die in battle. As expected by Zhang Junhao, shortly after it was completely dark, a battalion defense line was breached by the Japanese army, and the position was occupied, posing a risk of collapse for the entire regiment. Captain Zhao came to the backyard holding a pistol and ordered everyone to pick up their weapons and join him in the battle. Zhang Junhao originally wanted Wang Jinhui to stay, but Wang Jinhui insisted on following Zhang Junhao, so Zhang Junhao followed her. Anyway, she is someone else's sister who died in battle and was pulled down. If it were her own sister, he wouldn't let her go to the battlefield with anything. Don't use the word evil to evaluate Zhang Junhao. As for him, his awareness of good and evil is very weak. He only listens to the old class monitor for what he does, and how he does it depends on instinct. Zhang Junhao asked Wang Jingxian to carry a box of hand grenades and follow him into the darkness with the makeshift team. Wang Jinhui was next to Zhang Junhao, which made him very upset, but he persevered. More than 100 people, including staff members and cooks, all picked up guns and were heading towards the battlefield of death. 3 American pilots also held guns and walked together with Colonel Zhang and others. Zhang Junhao walked in the team, looking at the team through the shining artillery fire, feeling very shocked in his heart. At the time of departure, there were over 100 people. After the battle, how many people will still be alive? It's possible that everyone will die in battle. No one retreated, and under the command of Captain Zhao, everyone followed without hesitation towards the battlefield. Captain Zhao grabbed a soldier who was retreating in panic, pinned a pistol to his head, and roared angrily, "Those who retreat without authorization will be shot." Captain Zhao fired a shot into the sky, and a group of soldiers retreating were stunned. Zhao, the commander of the regiment, ran over and grabbed a second lieutenant by the collar. He pressed a pistol against his forehead and sternly said, "Go back. Take back the position for me." After the second lieutenant stood at attention and loudly said yes, he immediately turned around and led his team to charge back towards the Japanese army charging forward with bayonets. Captain Zhao fired at a Japanese soldier and the bullet hit their chest, causing them to fall. Captain Zhao waved his pistol and ran towards the Japanese soldiers, shouting, "Brothers, charge." Zhang Junhao loudly said to Wang Jingxian, "Please protect your sister and wait here for now. After we beat the Japanese back, you can come up again." Wang Jingxian loudly agreed. Zhang Junhao raised his .38 large cap rifle and fired at a Japanese soldier, who was shot in the forehead and fell down. Zhang Junhao rushed forward without hesitation. Zhang Junhao rushed into the Japanese army and fiercely stabbed a Japanese soldier with a bayonet. With just one thrust, he stabbed the Japanese soldier's chest in the opposite direction. After pulling out his bayonet, Zhang Junhao fired at a Japanese soldier and killed him before continuing to charge forward. A Chinese soldier hugged a Japanese soldier and rolled on the ground. Zhang Junhao walked over and used a bayonet to cut the Japanese soldier's neck, almost cutting off his entire head. A Japanese military officer swung his command knife towards Zhang Junhao, who used a bayonet to resist. After fighting back and forth for a while, Zhang Junhao found a gap and raised his gun, using a bayonet to knock over the Japanese officer. Zhang Junhao took the pistol of a Japanese officer and rushed into the Japanese army. He used the Japanese officer's pistol to shoot at the Japanese army consecutively. After Zhang Junhao killed 5 Japanese devils, the gun ran out of bullets. Zhang Junhao threw the pistol at a Japanese soldier and, while the soldier was evading, fired. The soldier's stomach was pierced and he curled up to the ground, covering his stomach. Zhang Junhao retrieved 2 hand grenades from 2 Japanese soldiers and threw them at places with a relatively large number of Japanese soldiers. Zhang Junhao lay in the trench and fired at the Japanese army who continued to charge towards him. Quickly, the old squad leader, Lieutenant Li, and 3 American pilots also arrived at Zhang Junhao's place, where they all lay together in the trench and fired at the Japanese army consecutively. After bloody hand-to-hand combat, in less than half an hour, the Japanese army was repelled and their positions were recaptured. Wang Jingxian and his siblings arrived carrying a grenade box. Zhang Junhao placed the box on the trench, pried open the box, unscrewed the back cover of the grenade, and placed it in front of them. Zhang Junhao taught Wang Jingxian the method of pressing bullets into the gun. Not long after the Japanese army retreated, shells flew over. After the deafening explosion, the earth trembled like a raging river. Zhang Junhao pressed Wang Jinhui with his body, hugged his head, and hid at the bottom of the trench. Occasionally, soil rolls over the sky and covers it layer by layer. At this point, we can only rely on fate. If the shell falls 1 or 2 meters away and does not explode, the shock wave will shake people to the point of bleeding. The Japanese army surprisingly used giant howitzers, as well as a large number of 60 mortars and infantry artillery. Captain Zhao's team became capable of slaughtering lambs, and they were killed and injured in the Japanese artillery fire. After about half an hour of shelling, the Japanese army launched another ground attack. A large number of Japanese soldiers, armed with bayonets and covered with heavy machine guns, rushed towards them. Zhang Junhao, covered in layers of soil, heard no more gunfire and the earth no longer trembled. Based on experience, it was judged that the Japanese shelling had stopped, and there would be infantry charging towards him next. Zhang Junhao struggled to get up, and the soil fell down from his body with a clatter. Suddenly realizing that Wang Jinhui was still below, he quickly reached into the soil with his hand and pulled her out. If he didn't pull her out, she would be buried alive. Wang Jinhui coughed fiercely. Zhang Junhao's mouth, ears, and nose are all covered in mud. After quickly cleaning the soil in his mouth, ears, and nose, Zhang Junhao assisted Wang Jinhui in cleaning it up. After cleaning Wang Jinhui's face with clothes, Zhang Junhao said to Wang Jingxian, "Immediately find all the grenades for me." Wang Jingxian loudly agreed. Zhang Junhao crawled out of the trench and searched for the bodies of the Japanese army. After finding them, he untied the armed belts from the bodies, as the bullet boxes and grenades were both hanging on the belts. He brought the armed belts, and the bullet boxes and grenades were also brought. "I found a good gun and brought it as well." Zhang Junhao placed the searched armed belts and guns on the edge of the trench and ordered Wang Jinhui to remove the bullet box and grenade. Zhang Junhao crawled out again and went further to find the body of a Japanese military officer. He brought back the Wangba box pistol, bullet box, and command knife. The old squad leader watched from not far away, his heart gripping his throat, afraid that Zhang Junhao might be hit by Japanese bullets while searching for ammunition. Shortly after Zhang Junhao climbed out of the trench for the third time to search for ammunition, Captain Zhao stood up and shouted, "Already, the Japanese army is launching another attack." End of this chapter.